Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about the most mysterious, polarizing, and arguably the most important figure in the entire Warhammer 40k universe, the Emperor of Mankind. There's no one like him. He's not just a ruler, not just a psyker, not even just a god. He is the foundation upon which the Imperium stands. Billions pray to him daily. Entire worlds exist solely to worship him. And the Astronomicon, humanity's only real lifeline across the galaxy, literally burns with his essence. Yet for all that, we barely know him. He's been alive for tens of thousands of years, perhaps longer. And even after all this time, no one can say with certainty who he really is, what he truly wants, or whether he's even still conscious on that golden throne. That's what makes this topic so endlessly fascinating. The Emperor isn't just a character, he's a mirror reflecting every hope, fear, and contradiction in the Imperium. He's the greatest protector humanity has ever known, but also its most brutal tyrant. He fights against the gods of chaos, yet created a galaxy that practically feeds them. His subjects call him the master of mankind, but some wonder whether anyone ever truly understood him. What makes him divine? Is it his power, his vision, his sacrifice? Or is it the blind devotion of a desperate civilization that turned a man into a god simply because they couldn't survive without one? To even begin to understand who the Emperor is, we need to look past the propaganda, the religious iconography, and the myths that surround him like an unending fog. Because underneath all of that, there was, maybe still is, a man. One who shaped human history like no other being ever could. And the further you go down that rabbit hole, the stranger, darker, and more fascinating it gets. The Emperor's origins are one of those deep-cut mysteries that even the most diehard fans can't fully agree on, and that's part of the magic. He didn't just appear out of nowhere during the Age of Strife, fully armored and ready to conquer the stars. No, his story goes way, way further back. We're talking prehistory, before the rise and fall of countless human civilizations, before the dark age of technology, before even the myths of Terra had names. If you really want to understand who the Emperor is, you have to start in the shadows of humanity's ancient past. One of the most popular theories, and the one Games Workshop flirts with from time to time, is that the Emperor was born around the 8th millennium before the Common Era. Not created, born. According to this version, he was the result of a conscious act by the ancient psyker shamans of Earth. These shamans, aware that chaos was growing stronger and that their souls were being devoured in the warp when they died, decided on a radical solution, a mass suicide ritual, that would reincarnate their collective essence into one single immortal being. That being, supposedly, was the Emperor. I remember the first time I read that theory, and it honestly blew my mind. Think about what that means. The Emperor isn't just powerful, he's literally a fusion of thousands of human minds, all bound by a shared will to protect mankind from the horrors of the warp. That's heavy. It adds a strange kind of nobility to him, a tragic core that makes you wonder if he ever truly had a choice in any of this. Was he born a god, or was he made into one by people too afraid to face death? Then again, not everyone buys into the shaman theory. Some fans speculate that he might have been a product of the Old Ones, those ancient Xenos who once guided evolution across the galaxy, or even some kind of natural anomaly, a singularity of psychic potential that just happened to emerge among humans. There are even fringe theories suggesting he might have existed before humanity itself, tied to some deeper cosmic purpose that goes beyond even chaos. It's wild, but in a universe as chaotic and myth-soaked as Warhammer, who's to say what's too far-fetched? What we do know, or at least what the lore gives us, is that this being lived through nearly every chapter of human history. He was there in ancient Mesopotamia, in the courts of Egyptian pharaohs, on the battlefields of Rome, guiding, nudging, shaping events subtly, never revealing his true nature, always operating behind the curtain. He was the advisor, the warrior, the philosopher, the scientist. And with every passing century, he watched humanity rise and fall again and again, never quite able to escape its own destructive nature. It's easy to romanticize that, this idea of an immortal shepherd, quietly tending to a species he believes in more than it believes in itself. But the more you think about it, the more it starts to feel like a kind of cosmic burden. Imagine living for tens of thousands of years, watching the same mistakes repeat over and over, knowing you could intervene, but choosing restraint. That takes more than wisdom. It takes something cold, something calculating. And that's where the cracks in his character begin to show. Because even in those early days, long before the Emperor crowned himself on Terra, he was already making choices that suggest he wasn't just a savior. He was a planner, a long-game strategist. Fans often debate whether he was truly benevolent or if he simply saw humanity as a project to be optimized, perfected, even if it meant breaking a few eggs, or a few billion. There are legends, scattered whispers in the Black Library and across the fan community, about events he may have directly caused, wars he may have allowed to happen, even leaders he may have quietly removed if they no longer fit his vision. The Emperor wasn't passive. He was active, selective, and above all else, focused. Focused on a future that only he could see, one that would take millennia to build. And perhaps, in his mind, no cost was too great if it meant saving humanity from itself. That's the part that gets me. He could have ruled from the start. With his power, he could have declared himself a god thousands of years ago and bent the world to his will. But he didn't. He waited. He learned. He observed humanity not as a god among mortals, but as a man studying his own reflection, trying to understand whether the species he came to protect was even worth saving. It's this tension, the love for humanity and the frustration with its chaos, that really defines who he was before he ever picked up a thunderhammer. So when people ask, who is the Emperor? I always say, he's a mystery that's been unfolding since the dawn of man. Not because we lack information, but because even what we do know raises more questions than it answers. A god made by shamans, a psychic titan walking among mortals, a silent manipulator watching civilizations crumble and rise again, he was all these things before he ever called himself Emperor. And maybe that's the real point. He wasn't born to lead an empire. He was forged to endure a nightmare. And in a galaxy like Warhammer's, that's probably the closest thing to divinity we're ever going to get. When people talk about the Emperor, they often jump straight to the Unification Wars or the rise of the Imperium. But honestly, the part of his story that haunts me the most is everything he did before that. The thousands upon thousands of years where he walked among us, not as a ruler, not as a god, but as a silent force in the background of history. That whole concept is so chilling and beautiful at the same time. Imagine it. The most powerful human being in existence, living through every age of man, watching civilizations rise and fall, and never truly revealing who he was. And we know he was there. The lore is full of vague mentions and half-truths, of an unnamed figure advising kings, guiding empires, and shaping the course of technological revolutions. There are stories of a mysterious stranger in ancient Babylon, a wise man in Greece, a warlord in Central Asia. Some fans even claim he was the real figure behind mythic archetypes like Merlin, Gilgamesh, or Confucius. Not in a magic man way, but in that subtle, always a step ahead presence that just nudges humanity a little further forward, always watching from the sidelines. If you look at our history through the lens of someone like him being real, it kind of reshapes everything. But the big question is always, why didn't he step forward earlier? Why wait? Why let humanity suffer through the dark age of technology, the age of strife, all the horrors that nearly wiped us out multiple times over? That's where the debates get intense. Some fans believe he couldn't reveal himself too early, that if he had claimed open power before the psychic potential of humanity had fully manifested, it would have drawn chaos to us prematurely. That maybe he needed to wait for a specific point in time when the warp was already tearing us apart, so he could justify his emergence as the savior. Others, though, go darker. They think he waited because he was testing us, that he wanted to see how far humanity would go on its own. It's this almost Darwinian approach. He lets us build, collapse, rebuild, and only steps in when the cycle becomes unsustainable. It paints him less like a protector and more like a gardener pruning a garden gone wild. There's something cold in that image, but also something deeply Warhammer. The idea that he's not here to hold our hands, but to make sure the species survives at any cost. Personally, I like the theory that he wanted to understand us as deeply as possible before trying to lead us. that he believed in humanity so fiercely that he was willing to suffer alongside it for thousands of years just to know its soul. That's such an intensely human thing, isn't it? To believe that knowing someone's pain, their failure, their madness is the only way to truly love them. And maybe the Emperor loved us in that same tragic, cosmic way. But it's not like he did nothing during those millennia. He was busy. There are countless hints that he had a hand in shaping key moments of human history. Some fans point to technological booms like the Renaissance or even the original spread of rational thought in early science as possible emperor interventions. Moments where he quietly reintroduced knowledge to guide us, maybe after pulling it from the ruins of older, fallen civilizations. The guy's basically the ultimate long-term strategist. He never rushes. He waits, he adapts, he plans centuries ahead. And that patience is what makes him so terrifying and so admirable at the same time. And yet, he must have seen so much suffering. Imagine watching the rise of fascism, the cruelty of imperialism, world wars, genocides. Imagine knowing you had the power to stop it, but deciding not to because the timeline wasn't ready yet. That would break most people. But the Emperor wasn't like most people. He wasn't driven by emotion, at least not the way we are. He was cold, calculating, but not heartless. That's the paradox. He cared so much that he allowed the world to burn, because he believed that only by walking through fire could humanity ever truly evolve. A lot of people hate that idea. They think it makes him monstrous. That any being who could watch the worst of history and choose inaction is no better than the tyrants he later overthrew. And I get that. It's uncomfortable. But that discomfort is what makes him such a compelling figure. He's not clean, he's not simple, he's not a hero, he's something other. A force of will that decided long ago that sentimentality had no place in galactic survival. And maybe, just maybe, he was right. When the Age of Strife finally descended, when warp storms cut off humanity's worlds from one another and techno-barbarians roamed Terra, the Emperor finally stepped into the light. And when he did, he didn't ask for permission. He didn't give speeches. He raised his armies, unleashed his science, and began the brutal process of uniting humanity by fire and blade. But before that, before the Thunder Warriors, before the Golden Armor, before the throne, he was just a shadow, a presence in the background, a ghost in history's machine. And I can't help but wonder how many times he looked at us, at all our chaos and madness, and asked himself, are they ready yet? And more importantly, will they ever be? When the Emperor finally emerged from the shadows, he didn't come as a savior in white robes or some divine prophet offering peace and enlightenment. He came as a warlord, a cold, unstoppable force draped in gold and lightning, wielding not just power, but absolute certainty. The Unification Wars were not a hopeful beginning. They were brutal, bloody, relentless, and they redefined what humanity was willing to endure in the name of survival. Terra at the time was a hellscape. The Age of Strife had torn the planet to pieces. Warp storms had isolated Earth from the rest of the galaxy, and the world regressed into a nightmare of techno-barbarian warlords, radiation-soaked ruins, and forgotten machines worshipped like gods. It wasn't just chaos. It was entropy incarnate. Civilization had collapsed so thoroughly that most people no longer even remembered they came from the stars. So when the Emperor stepped forward, he didn't have the luxury of diplomacy or ideology. He had to burn everything to the ground before he could build anything new. That's where the Thunder Warriors come in. Oh man, the Thunder Warriors. They were nothing like the later, more refined Astartes. These were monsters, engineered not for heroism, but for annihilation. Bigger, stronger, less stable. They were the Emperor's sledgehammer, designed to smash through the filth and decay of old Earth, to flatten everything that stood in the way of his vision. And they did. They tore through warlords, cults, gene clans, and entire nations with terrifying efficiency. No mercy, no pause, just conquest. And the Emperor? He didn't flinch. He watched as his creations slaughtered their way across Terra, and he gave the orders that kept the fire going. It's one of those moments in the lore that really challenges you. Because on one hand, what choice did he have? The planet was dying. Civilization was so broken that only total war could reset the board. But on the other hand, the cost was staggering. Whole cultures wiped out, cities razed, technologies lost forever. And the Emperor never once looked back. Some fans argue that this was the first real glimpse of his true nature. Not the wise, all-knowing father figure, but the cold idealist who believed the ends always justified the means. He wasn't trying to save what remained. He was trying to replace it. Purge the rot, sterilize the soil, and start fresh with something that could actually endure. There's something undeniably tragic in that. Like he'd given up on us being better on our own, so he decided to rebuild humanity in his image instead. And what an image it was. The imperial truth. The doctrine he spread wasn't spiritual or philosophical. It was purely rational, atheistic, scientific. No gods, no superstition, just unity under the banner of progress and reason. But the irony is, he had to enforce that truth with almost religious zeal. People didn't just follow the emperor because they believed in him. They followed him because his armies left them no choice. That contradiction has always fascinated me. The man who hated gods becoming one. The man who denied faith using the tools of fanaticism to build his empire. And let's not forget the Thunder Warriors themselves. When their job was done, when Terra was finally unified, they were discarded, not retired, not honored, erased. Most were exterminated, hunted down in the shadows by the Emperor's new agents. Why? Because they were flawed, imperfect, unstable. They were never meant to be part of the Imperium's future, only its brutal beginning. That decision still stings, even now. Some fans see it as a necessary evil, others as a cold betrayal. Either way, it speaks volumes about how the Emperor viewed people as tools, powerful, useful, but ultimately expendable in service of the grand design. And yet, despite all that, he did it. He unified Terra. For the first time in millennia, humanity stood under a single banner. The wars ended, the skies cleared, and the Emperor began building something no one had dared to dream of since before the Age of Strife. A united galaxy, free from chaos, ignorance, and fear. Say what you want about his methods, but that kind of vision, that kind of ambition, it's impossible not to be awed by it. There's this tension in the fandom when we talk about this era. Some see the Emperor as a necessary monster, someone who had to do terrible things to give humanity a future. Others see a tyrant who used the excuse of survival to justify atrocities. And honestly, both views are valid. That's what makes this period so rich. The Emperor stepped into the light, not as a hero, but as an architect of something far bigger than morality. He wasn't trying to be good, he was trying to win. And maybe that's the root of it. The Emperor never pretended to be kind. He promised order, unity, survival. In a galaxy falling apart at the seams, that was enough. People followed him because he made the chaos stop. Because his vision, however ruthless, offered a future. And when you're living in a world of ash and blood, sometimes that's all the hope you need. After unifying Terra, the Emperor didn't rest. He didn't celebrate or pause to reflect on the magnitude of what he'd achieved. That's not who he was. Because in his mind, Terra was just the beginning, one piece of a much larger puzzle. The real challenge was out there, beyond the Sol system. Scattered across the stars were lost human colonies, isolated for millennia, some thriving, others twisted by the horrors of the warp or corrupted by alien influence. To rebuild humanity into a single cohesive species across the entire galaxy, he needed something greater than armies. He needed symbols, he needed generals, he needed sons. And so, the Primarch Project was born. There's something deeply psychological about that choice. The Emperor, who had ruled alone for so long, decided to create 20 beings, each one a fragment of his own mind and soul, amplified and reshaped into something greater than human. Not equals, not clones, not companions, tools, weapons, leaders, and yet he called them his sons. That duality says so much about him. On one hand, it was an act of supreme confidence, even love. He poured immense care into each design, crafting them with unique traits, personalities, and strengths, as if imagining how each might rule, fight, and inspire. But on the other hand, it was pure control. He didn't birth them naturally, he engineered them, calculated their psychology, built them to serve a purpose. It makes you wonder what was going through his mind during that process. Was it affection, hope, or just cold necessity? Some fans believe he truly saw them as the future, extensions of himself that could achieve what he alone could not. Others argue he never saw them as individuals at all, just iterations of a greater algorithm, like pieces on a galactic chessboard. And when you look at how things eventually turned out, maybe they're both right. The idea was simple in concept but godlike in ambition. Create 20 superhuman leaders, each capable of leading a legion of space marines across the stars, each embodying a specific principle or trait the Emperor valued. One might represent justice, another strategy, another conquest, and so on. They weren't just warriors, they were cultural anchors, icons meant to bring order, identity, and inspiration to the worlds they liberated. That level of strategic foresight is mind-blowing. He wasn't just building a military force, he was building a mythology in real time. But then came the disaster. The scattering of the Primarchs. Somehow, the Chaos Gods got involved, either fearing what the Emperor was creating or simply acting out of spite, and the infant Primarchs were torn from the labs beneath the Imperial Palace and hurled across the galaxy. It was a catastrophe, no doubt. But here's the weird part. The Emperor didn't stop. He didn't mourn, he didn't rage. He just adjusted. He went ahead and created the Space Marines anyway, designing each legion in the image of the lost sons he believed he'd one day recover. That kind of determination, or detachment, is what makes him feel so alien. Most people would have broken. He just kept moving forward. And sure enough, as the Great Crusade began, the lost Primarchs began to resurface. One by one, he found them on distant worlds, raised by different cultures, shaped by strange environments, each one carrying a piece of him, but none of them exactly as he intended. And that's where things get complicated, because the Emperor had built them to follow, to be loyal instruments of his vision. But by the time he found them, they had become something else entirely. Individuals, rulers, heroes. Some embraced him instantly, others questioned him. Some even saw him as a rival. You can almost feel the tension in those moments. This man, who had calculated every variable, suddenly faced with outcomes he couldn't fully control. It's like watching a scientist meet the subjects of an experiment that evolved beyond the lab. And instead of recalibrating, he just pressed forward, as if willing the vision to remain intact, as if pretending nothing had changed. That's what makes the Primarch project so fascinating. It wasn't just about power, it was about control. About shaping the future in a way that didn't allow for deviation. And that mindset, it was always going to clash with the messy reality of living beings with free will. There's also this tragic undertone that fans love to explore. That maybe the Emperor did care. That he really did want sons. That for all his cold planning, he hoped to share his burden, to feel some kind of connection after so many lifetimes of isolation. But the way he went about it, building them rather than raising them, programming loyalty rather than earning it, set the stage for failure. You can't manufacture love. You can't code loyalty. Not without consequences. And those consequences would ripple through everything that came next. The seeds of the Horus heresy of betrayal and civil war were planted not just by chaos or pride, but by the Emperor's inability or refusal to treat his creations as equals. It's like he wanted a family, but only one that would obey. And that contradiction would cost him everything. Looking back, the Primarchs are both his greatest triumph and his deepest failure. They conquered worlds, inspired millions, and shaped the Imperium in ways no one else could. But they also rebelled, shattered legions, and broke the dream he'd spent millennia building. And maybe that was inevitable. Because when you try to shape perfection without allowing for humanity, you end up with something that looks beautiful, until it breaks. The Horus heresy. Just saying those words feels like opening a wound that never really healed. It's the event that broke the Emperor's dream into 1,000 pieces and nearly destroyed the Imperium before it even had a chance to solidify. And the hardest part to swallow? It wasn't some external force, some alien menace or chaos beast that kicked it all off. It was his own son, his favorite, Horus. And it's impossible not to wonder, how could the Emperor, the most powerful psyker humanity has ever known, the man who'd been planning this future for millennia, not see it coming? That's the question that's haunted fans for decades. Some call it hubris, others call it love. But whatever it was, it left the galaxy bleeding. And the truth is, maybe it wasn't one thing. Maybe it was a perfect storm of mistakes, misjudgments, and fatal blind spots that even the Emperor couldn't avoid. Let's start with the most basic, brutal theory. He trusted Horus too much. He raised him higher than any of the others, gave him the title of War Master, put put him in charge of the Great Crusade while he returned to Terra for his secret project. And not just that, he leaned on Horus emotionally in ways he never did with the others. There are hints, in lore and fan interpretation alike, that the Emperor saw Horus not just as a commander, but as the heir to his entire vision. And that's exactly what made the betrayal so devastating. Not just strategically, but personally. Now, some fans say the Emperor didn't see the heresy coming because he was simply too far removed. By that point, he was deep into his work on the Webway project, a bold, impossible plan to give humanity a warp-free means of travel and permanently sever our reliance on the dark, treacherous sea of chaos. It was a gamble with the potential to save humanity forever, and it consumed him. While he was locked away in the vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, pouring his energy into the project, he stopped watching the board, stopped listening. And that silence let chaos slip through the cracks. But even that feels a bit incomplete. We're talking about a being who could read minds, see through time, manipulate entire populations with a word. Could he really have missed all the signs? That's where the theories get more complex and more painful. There's a growing school of thought that maybe he did see it coming. That he saw the heresy as a necessary evil, a purge that would burn away weakness and leave only the strongest, most loyal parts of the Imperium behind. That he let it happen. Let his sons tear each other apart, because in the long run, it served his ultimate vision better than peace ever could. Honestly, I hate that theory, but I can't ignore how Warhammer it feels. That kind of grim, ends justify the means logic is baked into the setting. And if the Emperor really did operate on a scale so vast that mortal suffering was just a statistic to him, then maybe sacrificing half the legions and a few million loyalists didn't seem like failure. It seemed like pruning. But even if he didn't see it coming, there were signs. So many signs. Horus was already struggling under the weight of command. He was isolated, insecure, pressured to be perfect while dealing with the enormous complexity of managing a war that spanned thousands of worlds. And then the Chaos Gods made their move. Subtle, insidious, whispering into the cracks of Horus's soul. They didn't need to force him. They just nudged what was already broken. The tragedy is, Horus wasn't evil, not at first. He was proud, brilliant, loyal, just like the Emperor made him to be. But he also carried every flaw the Emperor refused to address. Emotional vulnerability, the need for approval, the fear of inadequacy. And when those cracks were exposed, the darkness rushed in. Horus didn't fall alone. He brought half his brothers with him, and with them, their legions. The galaxy that had just been unified was plunged into civil war. And the Emperor? He was too late. When he finally emerged, the Webway project in ruins, his empire was on fire. And the moment he realized how far things had gone, that Horus wasn't just rebelling, but actively trying to destroy everything they had built together. That was the moment he broke. Not on the outside, not in front of the others. But deep inside, you can feel it in the lore. This wasn't just a military crisis. It was a personal betrayal on a cosmic scale. Everything he had invested in his sons, everything he had planned for humanity, was unraveling because of a mistake he made. Not in strategy, but in trust. Some fans think the Emperor's greatest flaw wasn't arrogance or detachment or even his secrecy. It was that he thought he could shape human beings, his sons, his generals, without giving them the tools to handle their own humanity. He gave them purpose, but not guidance, power, but not understanding. And when they faltered, he either ignored it or assumed they'd self-correct. That's not leadership, that's engineering. And people aren't machines. The heresy wasn't just a failure of command, it was a failure of vision. A moment when the Emperor's grand plan collided with the chaotic, unpredictable reality of real people trying to live up to impossible standards. And in that collision, the dream cracked open, and chaos poured in. It's painful to think about, because you want to believe the Emperor was above all that he had to have known better. But maybe that's the most human thing about him. Maybe he didn't see it coming because he couldn't bear to believe that the people he loved the most were the ones who'd destroy everything. After Horus fell and the final battle ended aboard the Vengeful Spirit, nothing was ever the same again. The Emperor, this towering figure who had once commanded armies with a glance and shaped empires with a word, was now broken. Not just wounded, not simply injured. Broken, physically destroyed, psychically exhausted, spiritually dimmed. Carried back to Terra by his most loyal sons, he was placed upon the Golden Throne, a life support device originally intended to power his Webway project, now repurposed into something far more desperate, a prison to keep him barely clinging to existence. And this, more than any battlefield or betrayal, might be the cruelest fate in the entire Warhammer universe. People always ask, is the Emperor still alive? Technically, yes. His body continues to function, sustained by a continuous psychic sacrifice of thousands of psychers a day. His presence still fuels the Astronomicon, guiding ships across the warp. His spirit, or at least some echo of it, still seems to interact with the material world, especially in the rare moments where someone receives a vision or a miracle in his name. But alive feels like the wrong word. The Emperor isn't living, he's enduring. Trapped between life and death, thought and oblivion, godhood and decay. Some fans compare him to a living corpse, others to a divine firewall holding back chaos by sheer will. And there are those who believe his consciousness is long gone, that what's left on the throne is just a psychic echo, like a machine running a program after the user has left the room. But no one knows for sure. That's the thing that drives people crazy in this setting. No one knows. The High Lords of Terra, the Adeptus Custodes, even the Inquisition, none of them truly understand what the Emperor is anymore, and they're too afraid to look too closely. The very heart of the Imperium is built around that fear. The Golden Throne has become a sacred object. The Emperor's chamber is the holiest place in the galaxy. And the man who once denied godhood is now worshipped as a divine being by trillions. Every world in the Imperium bows to his name. Every victory is attributed to his will. Every tragedy is chalked up to some divine test of faith. And yet the being they venerate lies silent, unmoving, unseen. He is the light that never speaks. It's heartbreaking, honestly. There's this sense that the Emperor gave everything, his body, his mind, his very soul, to protect humanity. And instead of evolving or rising to meet his vision, humanity turned inward, built a religion around his corpse, fossilized his dream into dogma. The man who fought against superstition with everything he had became the god of a theocracy more brutal and irrational than anything he ever sought to destroy. If he is still conscious, I can't even imagine the torment. That's one of the most powerful undercurrents in the lore, that sense of grim irony. The Imperium didn't just fail the Emperor's plan. It reversed it. His great project to liberate humanity from ignorance and fear collapsed into a regime that runs on both. The Adeptus Ministorum, the Ecclesiarchy, the Inquisition, they enforce a worldview that the Emperor would have called heretical in his own time. But now, no one questions it, because no one wants to face what might be true. That the Emperor is gone, and they're just keeping the lights on. But what if he isn't gone? That's the theory that keeps coming back again and again. That somewhere, deep within the psychic maelstrom of the throne, the Emperor still watches, still thinks, still waits. Maybe he's healing, maybe he's evolving. Some fans believe he's transitioning into something else entirely. A true warp entity, a god not just in title, but in substance. Others think he's biding his time, waiting for the right moment to return, to rise, to cleanse the Imperium of all its corruption. The idea of the second coming of the Emperor is almost its own religion within the fandom. And then there's the terrifying possibility that he can't come back. That his existence on the throne is the only thing preventing the full collapse of humanity into chaos. That if he dies, truly dies, the Astronomicon fails, the warp storms return and the Imperium collapses overnight. That fear is what keeps the system running. The Golden Throne is not just life support, it's the linchpin of the entire galactic order. Everyone knows it's unsustainable, everyone knows it's decaying, but no one dares to pull the plug. There's this constant background dread in the lore, the idea that the Emperor is both savior and curse. That his presence, or what's left of it, is keeping things stable just long enough for the next great disaster to hit. And meanwhile, the Imperium continues to rot. The High Lords squabble, the bureaucracy expands like a tumor, and the ideals the Emperor once held get buried deeper under centuries of blood, fire, and silence. In a way, he's become less of a character and more of a haunting, a memory so powerful it still shapes the galaxy. a voice no one hears anymore, but everyone claims to speak for. The God Emperor of mankind, frozen in time, both the brightest beacon and the darkest warning. And maybe that's the real tragedy, not that he died or lived, but that the galaxy he tried to save never really understood what he was trying to do in the first place. This is where things get almost cruelly ironic. The Emperor, this towering, logic-driven being who spent thousands of years trying to drag humanity out of the mud of superstition and blind faith, ended up as the very thing he fought so hard to prevent. A god. Not just a symbol, not just a mythic figure, but an actual deity worshipped across millions of worlds, with temples in his name and priests enforcing doctrine in ways he would have found repulsive. The transformation from man to God didn't happen overnight. But when you look at it, the seeds were planted long before he was ever interred on the golden throne. It's weird to say, but in a way the Emperor set himself up for this. Not because he wanted to be worshipped, he was adamantly against it, but because he was just so far beyond what anyone could comprehend. Think about it. He was immortal, all-knowing by human standards, able to destroy armies with a thought, and guided by a vision so vast and intricate that even his closest allies couldn't fully grasp it. To the average citizen of the Imperium, especially after the heresy, there was no difference between what the Emperor was and what a god should be. And with him silent, unmoving, unreachable, well, faith filled the vacuum. What really drove it home, though, was desperation. After the heresy, the Imperium wasn't just wounded, it was traumatized. Half the legions had turned, half the galaxy was in ruins, and humanity had come terrifyingly close to extinction. The dream was gone, replaced with survivalism, paranoia, and fear. In that kind of environment, people don't cling to reason. They cling to belief. And what better belief than the idea that the Emperor hadn't fallen, but ascended? That he was guiding them still, watching over them, punishing the wicked and rewarding the faithful. It was comforting. And when something that comforting starts spreading, it's almost impossible to stop. The ecclesiarchy didn't start as the massive galaxy-spanning behemoth it is today. It began as a movement, the cult imperialists, started by those who truly believed the Emperor was a god incarnate. What's wild is that the Emperor himself had specifically told people not to do this. During the Great Crusade, he cracked down hard on anyone treating him as divine. He didn't want religion. He wanted unity through knowledge, science, reason. But after the heresy, the reins slipped. He wasn't around to shut it down anymore. And slowly, bit by bit, the cult grew. And then it fused with power. Enter Goj Vander, that infamous name that sends shivers down the spine of anyone even remotely familiar with the age of apostasy. Vander didn't just embrace the idea of the Emperor as God, he weaponized it. He took control of both the ecclesiarchy and the administratum, blending faith and bureaucracy into one monstrous machine. And it was under his rule that the Church of the Emperor truly crystallized into a force that could command billions and crush worlds in the name of purity. He wasn't a fanatic, though. He was a politician. He understood that belief was a tool, and he used it to horrifying effect. Now, most fans agree Vander went too far. He turned worship into madness, launched wars of faith against innocent worlds, and used the Emperor's name to justify some of the darkest atrocities in imperial history. But the thing is, once that kind of infrastructure is built, cathedrals, hierarchies, traditions, it doesn't just vanish. Even after Vander was overthrown during the Reign of Blood, the ecclesiarchy remained. It evolved, yes, and the Sisters of Battle were created specifically to keep it in check. But it remained. It became part of the Imperium's identity. You can't tear it out without collapsing the entire system. And that's the core of the paradox. The Emperor, the man who wanted to free humanity from the chains of ignorance, became the center of the most rigid, oppressive religious institution in the galaxy. The ecclesiarchy burns heretics, bans knowledge, and enforces dogma with a level of zeal that would make medieval inquisitors blush. And they do it all in his name, whether he wants them to or not. There are moments in the lore that suggest the Emperor hates what the Imperium has become. That if he could rise from the throne, the first thing he'd do is dismantle the ecclesiarchy brick by brick. Some fans believe he's trying to influence events from the warp, subtly guiding saints or psychers to course-correct the faith. Others argue he's given up, that he sees the faith in him as a necessary evil, the only thing holding the galaxy together in a time where truth is too fragile to stand on its own. And then there's the most haunting theory of all, that the Emperor is becoming a god in the warp. Not because he wanted to, but because belief makes it so. In the Warhammer universe, faith has power. Enough people believe something and it takes shape. So if trillions of humans believe the Emperor is a god, worship him with fervor, kill in his name, then maybe he is one now. Maybe his soul is shifting, ascending, not through intention, but through sheer psychic inertia. And if that's true, what does that mean for the man he used to be? This is the tragedy at the heart of it. The Emperor wanted humanity to stand on its own, to be rational, united, fearless, and instead they kneel, they pray, they burn. He gave them the tools to become a shining beacon in the galaxy, and they turned those tools into chains, locked themselves in cathedrals, and called it salvation. It's poetic in a really bleak way. The god who never wanted to be worshipped became the cornerstone of a religion too vast to ever undo. And yet, despite all that, people still believe. They find comfort in the Emperor's light, they fight in his name, they die for him. And maybe that's the only truth that matters now. Not what he wanted, not what he believed, but what he became. Because humanity needed him to. This is the part where things get uncomfortable. Because when you start peeling back the layers of the Emperor's legacy, it stops being a story about a savior and starts feeling like a long, cold look in the mirror. Was the Emperor truly good? Was he a benevolent shepherd trying to lead humanity out of darkness? Or was he something much more disturbing? A tyrant so obsessed with control and survival that he sacrificed everything else, including the very soul of his species? The answer isn't simple. And honestly, that's what makes the debate so fascinating and so haunting. Let's start with the obvious. The Emperor did terrible things. That's not even up for debate. He wiped entire cultures during the Unification Wars. He destroyed religions, silenced dissent, erased entire histories if they didn't fit into his grand vision. He created the Thunder Warriors knowing they'd be too unstable to survive, then had them slaughtered once their usefulness ran out. He built the Primarchs as tools, not sons. He sent his armies to die on countless worlds with no hesitation, because for him, individual lives were never the point. The species came first, the vision came first. Everything else was secondary. But here's where it gets complicated. Those decisions, as brutal as they were, often worked. The Emperor did unify Terra. He did build an empire capable of challenging chaos. He did give humanity a fighting chance in a galaxy that wants it dead, and that's the paradox. If you measure morality by results, it's hard to argue against him. Billions suffered, yes, but trillions lived. Civilizations fell, yes, but the species endured. In a universe as hostile and broken as Warhammer's, maybe that's the best anyone could hope for. Still, the way he did it, it's hard to ignore the sheer level of control he insisted on. The Emperor didn't just want unity, he wanted obedience. He pushed the imperial truth, a rigid doctrine that denied the existence of gods, denied supernatural beliefs, denied anything that couldn't be quantified or controlled. And while that might have made sense from a tactical perspective, to keep humanity grounded, prevent chaos from feeding on faith, it also erased so much of what made people people. Their stories, their hope, their sense of meaning, all of it sacrificed to keep the machine running smoothly. Fans often point out how manipulative the Emperor could be. He kept secrets from his own sons, sent them into wars without explaining the stakes, and punished them when they deviated, even when they were acting out of genuine loyalty. Magnus is the classic example. He broke the Emperor's command to stay out of the warp, yes, but he did it to warn him about Horus. And for that, his legion was shattered, his world burned, and his legacy ruined. Was that justice? Or was it the reaction of someone so obsessed with control that any deviation, no matter how well-intentioned, was seen as betrayal? Then there's the question of free will. The Emperor never really trusted humanity to govern itself. He didn't believe people would choose the right path if left to their own devices. So he engineered everything, through propaganda, through surveillance, through genetic design. Even his own image was a calculated mask. Sometimes wise, sometimes wrathful, sometimes distant. No one ever saw the full picture, because no one was allowed to. And that kind of leadership, no matter how effective, is hard to separate from tyranny. And yet, I can't bring myself to call him a villain. Not completely. Because there are these moments, faint, fleeting, where you can feel the weight he carried. The burden of being the only one who could see the big picture. Of knowing that if he stumbled, if he hesitated, it could mean the extinction of the species. That's the kind of pressure that doesn't allow for softness, that turns compassion into a liability. It doesn't excuse what he did, but it does make it more human. Some fans believe the Emperor was a tragic figure, someone who started with hope but lost faith in people along the way. That after millennia of watching humanity fail, he decided that freedom was a luxury we couldn't afford. That maybe he wanted to be the good shepherd, but the galaxy turned him into something else. A weapon. A wall against the darkness. And once you become that wall, you stop caring about what happens on either side of it. You just hold. Others argue he was always like this, that the Emperor was never about kindness, never about partnership, that his entire plan was rooted in domination, that he saw himself not as a leader, but as a replacement for human weakness. A perfect being building a perfect order, and in that vision there was no room for compromise, no tolerance for error, just obedience and results. The truth, I think, lies somewhere in between. The Emperor wasn't a saint, he wasn't a monster, he was a man with a purpose so massive it consumed everything else. And in trying to save humanity, he slowly stopped seeing the individuals that made it up. That's what makes him such a compelling figure. He's not easy to love. He's not easy to hate. He's complicated. And in a setting like Warhammer, that kind of nuance is rare and powerful. So was he good? I don't know. He gave us a future, but not a happy one. He fought for us, but never with us. He sacrificed everything, including himself. But maybe also too much. Maybe in the end, the Emperor saved humanity at the cost of its soul. This is the question that keeps the entire fanbase up at night. Will the Emperor ever return? It's one of the most haunting possibilities in all of Warhammer 40k. Not just because of what it could mean for the galaxy, but because no one can agree on what kind of return it would even be. Some imagine a glorious resurrection, the God Emperor reborn in radiant psychic fire, sweeping away the corruption of the Imperium and leading humanity into a new golden age. Others think it'll be the final death knell, an apocalyptic event that breaks the last thread holding the galaxy together. And honestly, either version feels equally possible. There's so much speculation around this, and not just from fans grasping at straws. The lore itself flirts with it constantly. Hints, whispers, visions from saints, cryptic prophecies, even occasional warp phenomena that seem to suggest the Emperor is still aware, still watching. And every time it happens, people start asking, is this it? Is this the moment? Will he rise? One of the more optimistic theories is the so-called Star Child theory. An old but still widely discussed idea that the Emperor's soul has already left the Golden Throne and is just staying in the warp, waiting to be reborn. In this version, his physical body is just a husk, and the real Emperor is evolving into a full warp god, one born not of chaos but of human hope, order, and reason. It's a powerful concept, almost messianic in tone. A second coming, but with a cosmic twist. A new kind of god for a new age. But there's a darker version of that same idea. What if, in becoming a warp god, the Emperor loses what little humanity he had left? What if the devotion of his followers, the blind faith, the wars in his name, the heretic burnings, has shaped his warp presence into something far more monstrous than he ever intended? The gods of chaos are born from emotion and belief, and if enough people worship a god of fire and judgment, well, they might just get one. A being of golden light that burns without mercy. If the Emperor returns in that form, he might not come to save the Imperium. He might come to punish it. Then there's the theory that he never left at all. That the Emperor's mind is still intact on the Golden Throne, and that he's fully aware of everything happening in the galaxy. That he's watching as the Imperium twists his vision into something unrecognizable, and that he's just waiting for the right moment, the right alignment of events to rise again. Some think Guilliman's return might be part of that setup, that the resurrection of the Primarchs is the first step in a grand endgame. A galactic reboot where the Emperor steps off the throne, sword in hand, and reclaims what's left of humanity. But if that happens, what would he do? That's the part that honestly terrifies me. Because when you look at what the Imperium has become, the ecclesiarchy, the dogma, the endless wars of purity, it's nothing like what the Emperor originally intended. His vision was flawed, yeah, but it was still rooted in progress, unity, reason. The current Imperium is a paranoid, xenophobic theocracy ruled by fear and fire. And you have to wonder, would the Emperor even recognize it? Would he feel pride that humanity survived, or horror at the cost? Some fans imagine he'd tear it all down, burn the cathedrals, dismantle the High Lords, break the ecclesiarchy over his knee and start from scratch. Others think he'd just walk away, that after everything he'd finally give up on the species he spent so long trying to save, that he'd vanish into the warp, leave us to our fate, and become just another myth whispered in the dark. And then, of course, there are those who think his return would trigger the final war. That chaos wouldn't sit idly by while their greatest enemy reawakens. That the Emperor's return would rip open the galaxy, drawing every demon, every traitor legion, every enemy of mankind into a last apocalyptic conflict. The end times. The final crusade. The Emperor as both savior and executioner. Honestly, if there's one setting where that outcome feels inevitable, it's Warhammer. But for all the theories, all the speculation, there's still this strange hope that lingers. Even among fans who criticize the Emperor, who see him as a tyrant or a failure, there's still that hope that maybe somehow he'll come back and set things right, that all the sacrifice, all the horror meant something, that humanity isn't just crawling toward extinction in the dark, but is actually part of some vast hidden plan, that the Emperor isn't dead. He's just waiting. Maybe that's what keeps the Imperium moving. Not truth, not logic, but that deeply human instinct to believe in a return, to think that no matter how bad things get, someone stronger, wiser, and more righteous will come back and fix it all. And in a galaxy as bleak as this one, sometimes belief is all you have. So will the Emperor return? I don't know, but I think the real question is, should he? Because whatever comes back from the Golden Throne, it won't be the man he was. It'll be something else, something born of fire, memory, faith, and silence. And whether that thing saves us or ends us, that's the part no one can predict. So after everything, after the millennia of war, sacrifice, silence, and flame, who was the Emperor of mankind, really? Was he the architect of humanity's salvation, the one being who saw the full shape of the galactic nightmare and tried to guide us through it? Or was he just another tyrant, one with bigger dreams and colder logic than most, who broke the species he claimed to love in the name of a future we never got to see? That's the core of the Emperor's paradox. You can argue it both ways, and you'd probably be right either time. And maybe that's the most Warhammer thing about him. He was greatness wrapped in tragedy. A visionary so far ahead of the curve that he had to drag humanity behind him, screaming and bleeding the whole way. His mind spanned centuries, his plans stretched beyond the stars, but his heart, if he ever let himself feel with it, was distant. The Emperor saw humanity not as it was, but as it could be. He wanted to build a species that could stand on its own, unshackled by gods, undivided by ignorance, united by strength and purpose. And the price of that dream was everything. What breaks me the most is that I don't think he ever had a moment of peace. Not once. Not as a child born of 1,000 dying psychers, not as the hidden guide of ancient history, not as the conqueror of Terra, not as the father of Primarchs, and certainly not as the shattered soul on the Golden Throne. His entire existence has been one long battle, a war against entropy, against chaos, against the very nature of mankind. And even now, even in death or whatever half-life he clings to, that war still goes on. His body burns. His mind, maybe, still holds the line. The Emperor never rests. And that's devastating. Some fans say he failed, that the Imperium today is proof his vision was flawed from the start, that by refusing to trust, by relying on force over compassion, he built an empire destined to rot from within. Others argue he succeeded as much as anyone could, that in a galaxy filled with demons, tyranids, and star gods, any version of humanity still standing is a miracle. I find myself somewhere in the middle. I don't think he failed exactly. But I don't think he won either. I think he endured. And he made sure we could too. The Emperor wasn't a god, not really. But he wasn't human either. not in any way that mattered. He was a singularity, a gravitational force around which the fate of our entire species bent. Every choice he made, every secret he kept, every battle he fought echoed across the stars. His shadow is still with us, stretching across the Imperium like a cathedral of silence and fire. And whether you love him, hate him, or just mourn what he became, you can't ignore what he meant, what he still means. In the end, maybe he was both shepherd and tyrant, both savior and executioner, both the first light of dawn and the last spark before darkness. And maybe that duality, his refusal to fit into any one category, is what makes him feel so real, so painfully, maddeningly real. Because the truth is, the Emperor of mankind wasn't just one person. He was a million decisions, 1,000 masks, a lifetime of sacrifices no one else was willing to make. He was the dream of a better future, carved into stone with blood and fire. And like all great myths, he leaves us with more questions than answers. That's the legacy of a god who didn't want to be worshipped, a father who couldn't save his sons, a ruler who built a galaxy that forgot what he stood for. So yeah, maybe he was never the hero we wanted. Maybe he never even wanted to be one. But in the grim darkness of the far future, where hope is a relic and faith is the only fuel left, the Emperor is still there, silent, watching, waiting. And maybe that's enough. If you've made it this far, thank you. I hope this deep dive into the most enigmatic figure in Warhammer 40k gave you something to think about, or at least made the galaxy feel a little more alive. If you enjoyed the journey, make sure to like the video, leave a comment with your take on the Emperor, and don't forget to subscribe for more lore dives, theory discussions, and everything else that makes this universe so damn addictive. See you in the next one.